It's stage 6 power cuts indefinitely, with Eskom announcing the breakdown of 11 generating units since yesterday morning. Unplanned outages and units offline for scheduled maintenance now total nearly 24,000 megawatts of power. That means Eskom is operating at well below 50% of its capacity. Let's speak now to energy analyst Ruse Moleshe. Ruse, I mean, it's really astonishing if you think of nearly 24,000 megawatts that are just out of commission. I wonder if you could start by putting that into context for our viewers.
Good evening, Sally. Good evening to the viewers. What that means is that, as you correctly point out, over 50% of the capacity we have in the country is not available. That means that we have an unreliability of the system, because our coal-fired power plants generally are supposed to run 24/7, are supposed to be the base load capacity that provides the stability, and then the other peaking or emergency systems are supposed to be met by gas supply. So if this is not available, that means that you even need more of the emergency power, which is from diesel, that is very expensive and not sustainable to run. So we are facing a serious problem. Eskom has been indicating that in terms of the reliability maintenance, it seems it has not been successful for them. So we are facing a system that can be interrupted anytime. And as the demand increases, people coming back from holidays, that problem is going to be exacerbated.
We know that diesel became a problem towards the end of last year. To run those open cycle gas turbines takes a lot of diesel, and we ran out of budget for diesel. Well, Eskom did. We also know that a plan was going to be made. The Pravin Gordhan, the minister, actually telling us on this program a plan was going to be made. So if I had to ask you, we know that there are myriad problems facing Eskom, but if I had to ask you what you think the main issue is at the moment that's put us into stage 6. We know units are breaking down all the time, but where are the biggest stresses, in your view, that's causing us to be staring stage 6 in the face once more?
The biggest stresses are in the coal fleet. From our supply side, we have unreliability of the coal fleet. And the coal fleet, the plan was that there would be a reliability maintenance that would be done over time to make sure that the reliability of these plants at least is managed. Now we have them working as if intermittently, if I can put it that way, which is not supposed to be the case. We also have a problem with a limited reserve margin. That means that should anything go wrong with the plants, we have limited ability to respond. So that is basically, yeah, that's the case, and that's going to continue to be the case for as long as the coal fleet is not reliable, unfortunately.
Look, we know that our coal-fired power stations are old, and those that are new have got some serious design faults and have had some unfortunate accidents. We also know that sabotage is a factor here. I mean, I'm getting a mental image of a boat with one leak, and then suddenly we've got 11, and it's just becoming more and more difficult to plug those holes. Is it getting worse? I mean, obviously the answer is yes, because we're now in stage 6, but do you see a general slide into deeper and deeper levels of load shedding?
Yes, we have. It's getting worse, mainly because we are not arresting the problem that was meant to be arrested, which is the problem of ensuring that reliability maintenance is done. Eskom has indicated in the latest reporting that they have not done that successfully. So we now have lost time to be able to do that. And the problem is getting worse. It's getting worse also because even the renewable energy projects that we thought, although they also have their own problems with intermittency, but we thought that they would come in. It seems that that program is also not successful. As you know, that there were supposed to be a lot of projects announced, but they don't have access to the grid. So they are not in the interim able to help us address that problem.
Yeah.
So the problem is getting worse. The longer you take to resolve the issues, the more problems you're going to have. The more unreliable the system, the less time you have to be able to fix these plants. So the problem will get exacerbated over time unless there's an intervention. And there hasn't been any credible intervention from when we started talking about this problem to now. That shows that at least we are trying to address the problem.
All right, so what would credible intervention look like? You've mentioned that we haven't had successful reliability maintenance, which is this plan to fix things before they break, essentially. That's my understanding. You say that has not worked properly. Why hasn't it worked, and what would credible intervention look like?
Why hasn't it worked? I mean, it ranges from Eskom not having the correct financial resources that they need to have. That's what they are telling us. It ranges from also the way that the management of the whole outages of this system has been done. Technically, within Eskom, hasn't been done well. It's a whole lot of different things. Then it's also about some of the outages that you see from Medupi, for instance, where the unit 4 of Medupi had an accident, and it's been out and it's going to be out for a long time. You also have Quebec being out. So it's a whole range of different things. Ideally, when you run a system like Eskom, in other countries, they have a reserve margin. That's a standby margin of power that when you have problems, you are able to do that. We don't have sufficient reserve margin. In fact, we don't have a reserve margin at all. So, yeah, we're stuck, basically, at this point.
Do you think things will get better when Koeberg's Unit 1 comes back online? How long is that going to take? 6 months, 3 years?
Yeah. They're not going to get better in the sense that you still have unreliability of the core. Remember that the coal fleet is over 80% of our supply. So without resolving those issues for most of those plants, you are still going to have intermittency, because even if the Quebec comes back online, where a number of units can just go off, and that will trigger a problem in the system. So the system is so tight in terms of demand supply that you don't have enough room to be able to deal with problems as they come.
Yeah, I mean, tight like a tightrope at this stage. At the same time, we are hearing some positive glimmers of hope. Of course, they come with their own challenges. I was reading a couple of articles in the Business Day newspaper this morning, and they mentioned that Gwede Mantashe, this was a few days ago, he, in December, gazetted this ongoing waiver of new electricity generating licenses. And also the lid has been lifted on the capacity limits. So all of this is trying to open up for alternative and private power producers to come on board. Also quoted in the Business Day, the SA Wind Energy Association saying that the market is starting to pick up. Is that your assessment too? Do you see that there's glimmers of hope with the private sector saying, right, we can fast track, we can move quicker than we thought possible?
Provided we can ensure that there's sufficient capacity in terms of the transmission and distribution network to be able to take the power from wherever it is to customers. We are currently having issues, as I said, with the round mid-window 6 projects, which were doubled in terms of capacity. We're very disappointed to find out those projects that thought that there was availability of infrastructure in terms of transmission, distribution. Those projects are not able to connect, and so as a result of that, we have capacity issues. So although there's a glimmer of hope, it's good that we have the private sector, but it must go with ensuring that there are lines to be able to transmit this power to where it's supposed to be. If that is a constraint, then there's no point in developing generation capacity when you are not able to get it to the customer.
Yeah, that has to be factored in as well, and that comes at huge cost, upgrading the grid for that. Whenever we face these very serious levels of load shedding, South Africans get frightened. They go, is this a sign that we're getting closer and closer to a blackout? And you speak to Eskom, you speak to energy experts, and they say, no, the whole point of load shedding is to avoid a blackout. But we're seeing a situation now where we have more power off the grid than currently on the grid and available. And we're told this is indefinite. We don't know how long it will last. Maybe it will improve, maybe it won't. You're not looking hopeful. What are your thoughts on whether we ever could really stare a full-on blackout, which would mean the entire grid going down, which would mean darkness for a few weeks, is my understanding?
Yeah, no, that's a scenario no one wants to contemplate. And the reason the system operator is there to ensure that doesn't happen. So what happens is that when the demand exceeds supply, to be able to balance the system, they will ensure that they do load shedding as much as possible. So the system to get to that point is not something that they would do easily. It's something that at all costs they would rather load shed us to death, for lack of a better word, than to let the system collapse, because it would be very difficult to get the system back online.
We're used to level 6, but I mean, how bad could it go? I mean, could we be looking at 12 hours or more without? I mean, are you saying that we would just simply be down to perhaps 1 or 2 hours of power a day, if it came to that, to sustain the grid, to make sure we don't have an all fall down?
So if to sustain the grid, we would have to increase the stages of load shedding. We would have to go beyond stage 6, beyond stage 7, to get to a point where we ensure that we don't crash the system. So what they would do to balance the system is just to reduce the demand, so that the system is kept at 50 hertz or around that to balance. So that would be the solution. But for the system to totally collapse, the system operator would not allow for that to happen. I'm not saying it's not feasible, but it would really not. Is something the mandate is to make sure that the system does not collapse.
And say what you like about Eskom, it's very clear they are actively trying to manage the situation. One of the big issues around a crisis, or something that's horrible to face, is acceptance. Acceptance is a very difficult thing. I think many South Africans are getting to a point of acceptance. A lot of South Africans simply don't have the resources to look at an alternative power system. But if you had to give one piece of advice to a South African consumer, what would you suggest in terms of trying to make their lives as normal as possible, bearing in mind the realities and what you're seeing down the line for our power supply?
The first thing would be for South Africans to recognize that right now there is no credible solution on the table. And when I say credible solution, I mean there are no supply options that are there right now to be able to help us to address supply problems. We have a supply shortage. We have an unreliable system. So for individuals who can afford, obviously those individuals would have to find alternatives, like alternative in terms of gas, maybe for cooking. They can look at solar home systems, perhaps a whole range of backup systems, if they could afford those, to be able to mitigate the problem, because the problem is going to be with us for a very long time.
All right. Well, thank you so much for chatting to us this evening. Always appreciate your insights. Energy analyst Ruse Moleshe.